Hello, everyone. I've been looking into something fascinating, and I'm wondering if any of you have ever heard rumors, or perhaps even seen something unusual regarding rail lines in remote or highly secure areas of the US. Not your typical freight or passenger lines, but something different. My interest started years ago, sparked by a brief, almost throwaway comment from a retired track inspector I met at a small-town diner out in Nevada. He was old school, gruff, didn't like talking much, especially about his decades on the rails. But after a second cup of coffee and a long silence punctuated only by the clatter of plates, he mumbled something about a section of line, way out past nowhere, that wasn't on his regular maintenance schedule, said it was pristine, always seemed recently worked on, but he was explicitly told it was off-limits, handled by federal guys. He wouldn't elaborate, just shook his head and changed the subject to the terrible state of modern rail beds. The comment stuck with me. Federal guys? On a private rail line? Or a seemingly abandoned spur? It sounded improbable, bordering on the kind of tall tale old-timers tell, but his demeanor, the genuine reluctance to say more, felt different. It felt like he was holding back something real, something he wasn't supposed to know, let alone mention. This wasn't just a spur to a forgotten mine or a derelict factory. His description hinted at something actively maintained, yet invisible. That conversation was the seed, planted in the fertile ground of existing whispers and internet chatter about classified facilities and hidden infrastructure. We've all heard the stories: underground bunkers, secret tunnels, undisclosed military installations. And logic dictates that if you have facilities requiring the movement of personnel or sensitive materials on a large scale, particularly those built or planned during eras when air transport was less ubiquitous or more vulnerable, rail would be a primary consideration. The United States has an extensive historical rail network, much of it built up during industrial booms and military expansions. While passenger travel declined, freight remained strong, and the infrastructure, though aging, is vast. It's easy to imagine segments of this network, perhaps short, critical links or discrete sidings, being repurposed or maintained for purposes far removed from commercial logistics. My initial skepticism warred with a persistent curiosity. What if the old track inspector wasn't spinning a yarn? What if there was a rail line, or sections of one, whose existence wasn't just unpublicized but actively obscured? My first steps were tentative, more out of curiosity than serious investigation. I started looking at detailed old railway maps, the kind produced decades ago that show every siding, every spur, every water tower. Comparing them to modern satellite imagery and publicly available GIS data was a painstaking process. Most discrepancies were easily explained. Lines abandoned, tracks pulled up, industrial areas redeveloped. But occasionally, I'd spot something odd. A stretch of track leading into a restricted area with no apparent conventional purpose. A siding marked on an old map leading into a military base where no active rail connection was publicly listed. These weren't smoking guns, not by a long shot. Military bases often have internal rail networks for moving equipment, but they're usually connected to the main lines, and their purpose is obvious. Logistics, heavy lift. What caught my eye were segments that seemed disconnected, or that led to locations with no visible rail infrastructure at their public-facing perimeter, hinting at subterranean access or heavily disguised entry points. It was like finding breadcrumbs, tiny hints that something might be there just out of sight. The internet, of course, is a double-edged sword for this kind of inquiry. It's full of speculation, wild theories, and outright fabrications. Filtering the signal from the noise is a monumental task. Forums dedicated to military history, infrastructure buffs, and even conspiracy theorists contained snippets that, when cross-referenced, occasionally aligned with my map observations. People mentioned unusual train movements near specific secure facilities, flatbed cars carrying strange covered cargo entering military depots late at night, or sections of track near known government relocation bunkers that seemed unusually well maintained, despite no public use. One recurring theme, though vague, involved locations associated with continuity of government planning during the Cold War. Places like Mount Weather, Cheyenne Mountain, and other lesser-known sites. Rail connections to these facilities, if they existed, would be logical for moving key personnel or assets during a crisis. But public documentation is virtually non-existent. This reinforced the idea that if a secret railroad existed, it wasn't a nationwide network, but likely critical links to specific, highly sensitive nodes. The key was identifying these nodes and seeing if there was any physical evidence of a rail connection, past or present, that wasn't openly acknowledged. My investigation broadened. I started looking at decommissioned military sites, old industrial complexes repurposed by the government, and even areas surrounding known black sites, though information on the latter is understandably scarce. I cross-referenced lists of government properties with historical railway lines. The sheer scale of historical US rail infrastructure made this incredibly challenging. Thousands of miles of track, hundreds of thousands of sidings and spurs, countless industrial connections. It was a labyrinth of iron and wood stretching across the continent. Finding a specific, potentially hidden needle in this haystack required a systematic approach, focusing on areas with high concentrations of sensitive government or military facilities, particularly those established during periods when rail was the dominant mode of heavy transport. I learned to identify the subtle signs in satellite imagery, changes in vegetation indicating a buried track bed, old overpasses or underpasses that seemed to serve no current road or rail line, or ground disturbances suggesting underground construction near railway corridors. It was slow, tedious work, yielding far more dead ends than promising leads. But the possibility, however remote, that the old track inspector's comment pointed to something real, something significant and deliberately hidden, kept me going. The question remained, where would such a line really go? And why the secrecy? The next step involved digging deeper into the history of specific secure locations. Take, for example, certain facilities associated with Strategic Command or National Archives. Public records often mention road access and airfields, but rail is rarely, if ever, listed as a significant means of transport. Yet, historical accounts of wartime logistics or Cold War preparations frequently highlight the reliance on rail for moving large volumes of material and personnel quickly and securely. It seemed improbable that strategic planners would not consider rail access for critical, hardened sites. This suggested two possibilities. Either rail access was deemed unnecessary or impractical for these specific locations, which seemed unlikely for large underground complexes, or it was deliberately kept off the public record. The latter seemed more plausible, aligning with the need for secrecy surrounding critical national security infrastructure. I began focusing on the areas immediately surrounding these known secure sites, examining historical aerial photographs alongside modern imagery. I looked for faint traces of old rail beds extending towards the facility perimeter, or unusual topography suggesting cut-and-cover tunnel construction near a railway line. The results were frustratingly ambiguous. Many sites were built in remote, undeveloped areas, and historical records from those periods are often incomplete or deliberately vague. Fences, berms, and dense vegetation obscured ground-level details, making definitive identification of rail access incredibly difficult. Despite the lack of clear-cut evidence, the sheer persistence of the rumors and the occasional, unexplained observation by others suggested there was more to it than pure speculation. I started reaching out, cautiously, to individuals who might have had tangential knowledge. Retired engineers who worked on large government construction projects, former military personnel who served at sensitive bases, even railroad employees who worked lines near restricted areas. Finding people willing to talk, even anonymously, was challenging. Most were either genuinely unaware of anything unusual, or they were acutely aware of the potential ramifications of discussing classified or sensitive information, even years after retirement. A few offered cryptic remarks, confirming the existence of certain restricted zones near rail lines where trains occasionally operated under unusual protocols, but they offered no details about destinations or cargo. One former freight conductor mentioned a specific branch line in the eastern US that, while appearing derelict, occasionally had sections cleared and inspected by non-railroad personnel, and that he'd seen specialized windowless cars parked on a hidden siding near the end of the line, often under heavy guard. This was more concrete than vague rumors, but still lacked crucial details. It confirmed the how, specialized cars, unusual maintenance, but not the what or the where specifically. The where remained the central mystery. Was it a single destination, a network of sites, or something else entirely? This pursuit felt like assembling a massive, incomplete jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were missing and the other half were disguised. The secret railroad wasn't a mythical entity spanning the country in hidden tunnels. It was more likely a collection of disconnected, critical links serving specific, sensitive nodes within the existing or historical rail infrastructure. The secrecy wasn't necessarily about the tracks themselves being invisible, but about their purpose, ownership, and the nature of their use. Identifying these links required painstaking cross-referencing of geographical data, historical records, and anecdotal accounts, searching for congruence where none should logically exist in the public domain. It was a process of looking for anomalies, a sudden, unexplained change in track ownership near a government facility, a spur that appears on old maps but is missing from new ones despite no record of removal, or persistent reports of unusual activity on a seemingly disused line. The deeper I delved, the more I realized that if such a system existed, its effectiveness relied not on being physically hidden, but on being functionally invisible. Its operations disguised within the vast complexity of the national rail network, or its purpose simply unacknowledged and undocumented in public records. The geographic focus began to narrow based on the more credible, albeit vague, reports, and the correlation with known, secure facilities. Areas in the Mountain West, known for extensive underground construction and strategic command centers, and the Eastern Seaboard, home to numerous continuity of government sites and critical infrastructure, emerged as potential zones of interest. I spent hours analyzing satellite imagery of these regions, following rail lines as they snaked through remote valleys, skirted military reservations, or disappeared into tunnels near suspicious land parcels. I learned to distinguish between legitimate industrial spurs, mining lines, and potential points of interest. A spur that ended abruptly at a mountain face or disappeared into dense, restricted forest land became more significant than one leading to an active quarry. A section of track that looked unnaturally well maintained for a line listed as inactive was worth noting. It wasn't about finding secret stations or hidden portals. It was about finding subtle clues on the landscape that suggested a non-public connection to a secure site. This part of the process was incredibly time-consuming and often demoralizing, yielding vast amounts of mundane information for every tiny potential lead. One area that consistently appeared in whispers and vague mentions was a region in the western United States, known for its vast military land holdings and involvement in various classified programs over the decades. Public maps showed a limited rail network serving the main facilities, but historical documents from the mid-20th century occasionally referenced extensive internal rail construction within the larger reservation boundaries, far from the main public access points. These internal lines were primarily described as industrial or logistical, used for moving materials during construction or routine base operations. However, coupled with reports of unusual train movements and specialized equipment being brought into the area by rail, it suggested these internal networks might have a purpose beyond standard logistics. Satellite imagery revealed complex track arrangements within certain secure zones, some leading towards reinforced structures or disappearing underground near hillsides. These weren't just simple sidings. They looked like marshalling yards or transfer points. The question wasn't if there were rail lines within these secured areas. That much was visible. But where? They ultimately led, especially the segments that seemed to vanish into the landscape and what was being transported on them under such tight security. The information I was gathering was piecemeal, like trying to understand an elephant by touching only small, disconnected parts. I had glimpses of potential access points, vague descriptions of unusual trains and correlations with known secure locations. But the central piece, the destination and the purpose, remained elusive. Was this secret railroad a single line to one crucial bunker? Was it a distributed network connecting multiple sites? Was its primary purpose personnel evacuation, sensitive cargo transport, perhaps nuclear materials or classified equipment, or something else entirely? The historical context suggested origins rooted in Cold War contingency planning, but were these lines still active, repurposed, or merely maintained as a legacy system? The former track inspector's comment about it being actively maintained by federal guys strongly suggested ongoing use or readiness. This wasn't ancient history. It was potentially a current, albeit clandestine, operational capability. And if it was current, understanding its purpose and destination felt increasingly important, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a contemporary piece of the national security puzzle. The challenge was moving from identifying potential locations and activities to understanding the why and the definitive where does it really go. My research pointed more strongly towards certain historical projects and locations known for deep underground facilities or significant roles in national contingency planning. These sites, often remote and sprawling, were logical candidates for needing secure rail access. For instance, sites associated with the Strategic Air Command, SAC, during the Cold War, or locations designated for continuity of government operations. Many of these were established or significantly expanded during the 1950s and 60s, peak periods for rail as heavy transport. While public information on their rail connections was minimal, engineering documents from that era, sometimes found in unexpected places like university archives or historical society collections focused on industrial development, occasionally referenced rail infrastructure related to the construction or supply of these facilities. These references were often oblique, talking about specialized transport needs or secure material handling. But when combined with map data and satellite imagery, they helped build a more concrete picture of where potential rail lines might have been built or extended. It wasn't about finding classified blueprints, but about finding overlooked details in publicly accessible historical records that, when viewed in context, pointed towards a hidden truth. One persistent thread involved locations in the vicinity of major military command centers or strategic asset storage sites. These are places where the movement of high-value or highly sensitive items is a constant requirement. While road and air transport are used, rail offers advantages for heavy, oversized, or numerous shipments, as well as providing a secure corridor less susceptible to certain forms of interdiction than road convoys. The possibility emerged that the secret railroad wasn't just about passenger transport or evacuation, but about the secure movement of materials crucial to national defense or strategic operations. This could include components for nuclear weapons, classified electronic equipment, or other assets requiring a high level of security during transit. If this were the case, the rail lines would likely lead directly into hardened facilities, possibly via tunnels or heavily secured transfer points, minimizing exposure during loading and unloading. This hypothesis fit with the descriptions of specialized windowless cars and heavy security reported near potential access points. It transformed the search from finding passenger terminals to finding reinforced loading docks or tunnel entrances connected to the rail network. The sheer scale of the historical rail network in the US made tracing every potential spur or siding an impossible task for an individual investigator. I had to prioritize based on the confluence of factors: proximity to known secure government military sites, historical context related to Cold War planning or strategic asset management, and any anecdotal evidence, however fragmented. This led me to focus on a handful of specific geographic areas that seemed to exhibit multiple indicators. These weren't areas with active, publicly used rail lines, but rather regions where disused or obscured rail segments were present near critical facilities. I started building detailed maps overlaying historical railway data with modern satellite imagery and public land ownership records. This allowed me to identify parcels of land owned by the Department of Defense or other government agencies that encompassed or were immediately adjacent to historical rail lines that appeared to end abruptly or divert into restricted areas. It was a tedious process of elimination, ruling out lines serving legitimate commercial or industrial purposes and highlighting those whose path and termination points seemed anomalous. This methodical approach began yielding more specific, albeit still unconfirmed, leads. In one instance, near a large military reservation known for its role in ordnance storage, historical maps showed a branch line that extended significantly further into the restricted area than any currently visible rail infrastructure. Satellite imagery showed a clear linear feature following the path of this historical line, but it was overgrown and appeared disused for most of its length. However, closer examination of the area where this feature terminated revealed a complex of reinforced buildings partially obscured by earthworks, with what appeared to be a rail access point, a large, reinforced door or tunnel entrance, visible in higher resolution imagery from certain angles. There was no public record of an active rail connection to this specific complex. This wasn't definitive proof of an active secret railroad, but it was compelling evidence of a potential connection, a facility built with rail access in mind, possibly for the secure handling of materials stored there. This kind of specific, localized finding was far more valuable than general rumors, providing a concrete point for further inquiry, even if access to the site itself was impossible. Another area of interest was near a facility known for housing critical data archives and serving as a potential relocation site for government personnel during a crisis. Historical accounts of its construction mentioned extensive logistical challenges, and old photographs showed temporary rail lines used to bring in materials. However, there were also whispers, never officially confirmed, of a permanent rail link being established to ensure secure access for personnel and data transfer. Examining the area on maps and satellite imagery revealed a section of rail line that ran adjacent to the facility perimeter but seemed to end in a heavily wooded, restricted area just outside the main entrance. There was no visible station or conventional siding. However, subtle ground disturbances and the layout of the surrounding security features suggested a possible buried line, or a discrete access point hidden within the landscape. The key here was the type of facility, one focused on data and personnel, suggesting a different purpose for any rail link compared to an ordnance depot. This hinted that the secret railroad, if it existed as a collection of disparate links, might serve multiple, distinct classified functions depending on the location it connected to. The consistent theme emerging from these localized investigations was that the secret railroad wasn't a dramatic, hidden network like something out of fiction. It was more subtle, more pragmatic. It was about utilizing or adapting existing infrastructure or building short, critical, and heavily secured links to specific facilities that required a level of access and security beyond what standard road or air transport could provide. The secrecy stemmed from the classified nature of the locations being served and the materials or personnel being transported, not from the impossibility of ever seeing a train or a track segment. In many cases, the tracks themselves were visible on maps or satellite imagery, but their significance was obscured by their disuse, their remote location, or the lack of public information about the facilities they potentially served. The challenge wasn't finding something completely invisible. It was understanding the true purpose of something that was deliberately made unremarkable, or its connection to classified sites simply never publicly acknowledged. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit, not into a picture of a nationwide conspiracy, but of a network of critical, discrete links serving the deep state infrastructure built largely during the Cold War, and possibly still maintained for contemporary needs. Delving into the historical context of strategic infrastructure development during the Cold War proved crucial. The perceived threat of nuclear attack spurred extensive planning for continuity of government and the secure relocation and protection of critical assets and personnel. Rail, with its ability to move large numbers of people and tons of material securely, was a natural fit for such plans, especially for hardened, often subterranean facilities. Projects like the construction of major underground command centers or vast archival storage sites relied heavily on rail for delivering materials during their construction. It is highly probable that permanent rail links were incorporated into the final design of some of these facilities to ensure ongoing secure access. These wouldn't be public stations. They would be reinforced portals leading directly into the secure zone, designed for rapid loading/unloading and minimal exposure. The historical record, though sparse on specifics for classified projects, provides the raison d'être for such a secret railroad. It wasn't built for convenience. It was built for survival and operational necessity in a crisis scenario. My investigation led me to look closely at locations identified historically as potential targets or critical nodes in a national emergency. These included areas near the nation's capital, sites associated with strategic command, and areas designated for the storage of critical national resources. In the vicinity of Washington, D.C., for example, there are historical accounts and surviving remnants of extensive civil defense planning, including potential evacuation routes and hardened facilities. While road and air were primary modes, the density of personnel and critical documents requiring relocation suggested rail would have been a necessary component of a large-scale evacuation plan. Examining old railway maps around the capital area, one can see numerous lines and spurs, many now gone or repurposed, that extended into areas historically associated with government operations or potential relocation sites. Identifying which, if any, of these might have been designated or maintained for classified use, and whether any connection still exists, became a focus. It wasn't about finding a hidden subway under the White House, but about finding potential secure railheads serving hardened facilities in the surrounding region. The concept of secure government rail lines isn't entirely without precedent in publicly available information, though references are usually historical or oblique. For example, during World War II, The Manhattan Project utilized rail extensively to move sensitive materials like uranium and plutonium, often in specialized, heavily guarded trains. While these were wartime measures, the infrastructure and protocols developed could easily have been adapted for Cold War needs. Similarly, the military has always had internal rail networks on its large bases, but the use of these networks for classified purposes or connections to non-public facilities is what constitutes the secret aspect. The challenge was proving that this wasn't just historical capability, but something that potentially exists or is maintained today. The anecdotal reports of unusual train movements on disused lines and the sighting of specialized cars were critical here, providing contemporary hints of continued use or readiness. It suggested that the secret railroad wasn't just a relic of the past, but a potentially active, albeit low-profile, part of modern national security infrastructure. Identifying potential destinations became a process of cross-referencing the locations of suspected rail access points with known secure government or military facilities. These weren't just any bases. They were sites known or rumored to have significant underground components, critical command centers, or roles in storing high-value assets. The pattern that emerged suggested that the secret railroad links were likely point-to-point connections between major nodes, rather than a sprawling, interconnected network. One line might connect a secure storage depot to a processing facility, another might connect a command center to a relocation bunker, and yet another might serve as an emergency evacuation route from a critical metropolitan area to a hardened shelter. The sheer variety of potential purposes made the investigation more complex, as the type of infrastructure and operational protocols would likely vary depending on what was being transported and where it was going. It wasn't a single secret, but potentially multiple secrets, each tied to a specific link and destination within this shadowy network. The difficulty in obtaining definitive proof lies in the nature of classification. Information regarding the transportation of sensitive materials, the location of critical national security assets, and the infrastructure designed for continuity of government operations is among the most tightly controlled by the government. Accessing official documents related to these topics is impossible for a private individual. Therefore, the investigation had to rely on indirect evidence, historical records that predate the highest levels of classification, analysis of publicly available geographical data, maps, satellite imagery, and the slow, painstaking process of gathering and corroborating anecdotal accounts from individuals who might have had brief, authorized but non-detailed exposure to these systems. It was detective work focused on public shadows and historical footnotes, trying to infer the existence and purpose of something deliberately kept out of sight. This limited the potential for a dramatic reveal. Instead, it was about building a case based on the accumulation of subtle, consistent indicators. One area that yielded particularly compelling, albeit still circumstantial, evidence was located near a vast remote government landholding with a known history of involvement in classified research and development. Historical maps showed a mainline railway passing nearby, with several spurs branching off into the restricted area. While some of these spurs served visible facilities, one particular branch seemed to extend into a heavily forested, undeveloped part of the reservation, ending in an area where satellite imagery showed a significant amount of earth-moving and construction activity over several decades, but with no visible surface structures commensurate with the scale of the work. The ground contours and vegetation patterns suggested potential tunnel entrances or heavily disguised portals. Coupled with vague, persistent rumors among railway enthusiasts about this specific line being subject to unusual security patrols and infrequent late-night movements of specialized trains, it painted a picture of a potential active classified rail link serving a hidden, possibly underground facility within the reservation. This wasn't idle speculation. It was based on observable features on the landscape and corroborated though anonymously and without detail, by individuals who worked the surrounding rail network. The sheer scale of land owned by the Department of Defense and other government agencies across the United States provides ample opportunity for such discrete infrastructure to exist. Millions of acres, much of it remote and restricted, could easily contain segments of rail line, spurs, or even short, dedicated links to secure facilities that are not publicly acknowledged. The challenge isn't just locating these potential links on a map, but understanding their current status and purpose. Are they legacy systems, maintained in a state of readiness for a contingency that may never arise? Are they actively used for low-profile transport of sensitive materials? Or do they serve a function entirely unknown to the public? The answers likely vary depending on the specific location and the facility it serves. A rail link to a continuity of government bunker might be maintained but rarely used, while a link to a strategic asset storage facility might see more frequent, albeit clandestine, activity. This variability adds another layer of complexity to the investigation, as there isn't a single America's secret railroad, but rather a collection of potentially unrelated, classified rail links, each with its own purpose and operational status. My focus increasingly shifted from trying to find a single, definitive secret railroad to identifying and documenting individual instances where rail infrastructure appears to serve a non-public, potentially classified purpose. This involved compiling a database of suspicious locations, areas where historical rail lines enter restricted government land and disappear, sites where satellite imagery suggests underground construction near rail corridors, and locations where credible anecdotal reports place unusual train activity on disused lines. Each entry in this database is a piece of the larger puzzle, contributing to a more complete picture of this hidden network. It's not about revealing state secrets or compromising national security. It's about documenting a hidden aspect of America's infrastructure, understanding how critical functions are supported by systems that operate outside of public awareness, and verifying whether the rumors and whispers about a secret railroad have a basis in reality. And based on the evidence gathered so far, the answer is increasingly leaning towards yes, not in the form of a nationwide underground network, but as a series of critical, discrete links serving key nodes within the US security apparatus. The culmination of this investigation points not to a single mythical secret railroad, but to the reality of multiple specific rail links serving classified purposes at secure locations across the country. These are not public transport lines or conventional freight routes. They are likely dedicated spurs, sidings, or short branches leading directly into military bases, hardened government facilities, or strategic storage sites. Their existence is often obscured by their location within restricted areas, the disuse of the visible track segments leading to them, or simply the lack of any public acknowledgement of their function. The secret lies not necessarily in the physical invisibility of the tracks, but in the classified nature of their use, the movement of personnel, critical assets, or sensitive materials under strict security protocols away from public scrutiny. Tracing the ultimate destination of these lines is the final and most challenging piece of the puzzle. While I cannot access classified information, the correlation between the suspected rail access points and the known or rumored locations of secure government and military facilities provides strong indicators. These lines likely lead into the heart of these sites, into hardened bunkers, deep underground storage vaults, secure command centers, or classified research facilities. They serve as critical arteries for the transport of resources vital for national defense, continuity of government, or strategic operations. The nature of the destination dictates the purpose of the line. A link to a strategic missile silo complex might transport components or personnel, while a link to a government relocation site might be designed for rapid evacuation and secure data transfer. The evidence, painstakingly gathered from historical maps, satellite imagery, and fragmented anecdotal accounts, paints a picture of a network that is less dramatic than popular fiction suggests, but far more realistic and arguably just as significant. It is a hidden layer of infrastructure, built during specific periods of perceived threat, like the Cold War, and likely maintained or kept in a state of readiness for contemporary needs. It represents a pragmatic approach to national security logistics, utilizing the inherent security and capacity of rail transport for purposes that cannot be entrusted to conventional systems. So while there isn't a single continuous America's Secret Railroad spanning the nation underground, there are strong indications of multiple, discrete, and classified rail links serving critical government and military facilities. These lines are part of the hidden architecture of national security, operating outside of public view, their purpose and destinations known only to a select few. My investigation has not uncovered a fantastical conspiracy, but rather confirmed the existence of a pragmatic, albeit secret, logistical capability woven into the fabric of America's vast, complex railway history and its contemporary security infrastructure. The question of where these lines really go finds its answer not in a single secret location, but in multiple, highly secure sites across the country, each representing a node in the network of American defense and governance, served by rail lines whose existence and purpose remain largely hidden from the public eye.